So welcome to this next webinar. We're going to be exploring the Canadian cannabis system. We're going to be looking at cannabis recreationally, medically, and CBD as well. And we are honoured to be joined by David Clement, who is the North American Affairs Manager at an advocacy group in Canada called Consumer Choice Centre. So David, first of all, tell us a little bit about what it is you do at the Consumer Choice Centre.
So as you said, I'm the North American Affairs Manager for the group. We're a consumer advocacy group that talks about when government policy or regulation impacts consumers and patients. And so we work on all sorts of issues, everything from free trade to the sharing economy. But one of my areas of expertise for the organization is cannabis policy, in particular Canada, but also abroad. And so that's what I've spent quite a bit of my time focusing on, is the ins and outs, the nuances of what has happened since Canada legalized cannabis, and more importantly, what needs to be changed moving forward. And importantly, what shouldn't be replicated internationally when other governments look to legalize, and if they look to Canada, what they should avoid replicating.
Great. So it sounds like you've had a busy few years with all of that in the mix. And then obviously you've got cannabis as a whole plant product in itself. You've got the medical side, the recreational side. Then you've got THC. Then you've got CBD and these individual products which, you know, can work together or work apart. And you've got so many different needs of the different people and reasons why people want X, Y, Z in their lifestyles. Can you give us a bit of a recap of the relationship that Canadians have with cannabis and how we got to the point of legalization and kind of what's happened since then?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it was quite a while ago, I want to say in the 90s, where it was established that that cannabis could be used for medical purposes. And so via a court decision, cannabis was legalized medically. For medical patients for a variety of different ailments. That system more or less continued on until it was commercialized. This would have been in the mid-2000s. So the process of having actual companies grow cannabis to meet the medical market, and obviously with our I say new government, but it's our most recent government, the Trudeau government. They sought to legalize adult use recreational cannabis as well. And so Canadians' relationship with cannabis is long-standing. It's something that has existed for a long time. I think that the Trudeau government needs to be applauded for their move to legalize recreational cannabis, both from a criminal justice perspective, but just more from a paternalism perspective. From my view, adult use cannabis is relatively benign, and it needs to be regulated as such. And that's really where we have a lot of our problems today, is in that process from transitioning from just medical to recreational. The Cannabis Act outlined a long list of, in my opinion, very onerous, and in some instances just downright ridiculous regulations on the legal space. And we can certainly go into what some of those examples are. But the big issue with those instances of overregulation is that every time you overregulate the legal space, you make the illegal space more attractive. And everybody knows the illegal space existed for years, decades even, prior to legalization. And so that has been, in my opinion, the biggest mistake the federal government has made, is not realizing that every time they add more red tape or more regulations to the legal space, it doesn't mean that people aren't consuming cannabis. It just means that they aren't consuming legal cannabis.
Yeah. And what would some of those kind of shortcomings be? Because you're talking about the needs of people, first of all. You're talking about the access and granting people convenient, cost-effective access. You're talking about, I suppose, eradicating a black market in an ideal world, where perhaps you're making a legalized product and a regulated product, which is cleaner and safer and traceable, more appealing and maybe even cheaper to access than black market cannabis. But then you're also talking about taxes and the government and economy and all of that. So what, for you, from your perspective and your role as an advocate, have you seen as the major kind of shortcomings with all of this in the last few years? Since legalization, I suppose.
Yeah, so I think the major shortfall is that the government failed to understand that cannabis can largely fall into three categories.
Mm-hmm.
It can be a prescription medicine, it can be a wellness product, and it can be a recreational product. And so whenever they were applying their lens of regulation, they treated cannabis differently, and it fell into one of those three buckets. And so they never committed to regulating it under one set of rules. And an example that I can give you on that is the production regulations, which have been somewhat liberalized since legalization. So the production regulations that were originally set up were for the medical system. Those were largely pharmaceutical grade regulations. So very strict, extremely expensive, and obviously those expenses get passed on into the price of the final product. When we moved from the medical to the recreational market, we didn't deregulate the space in a way that represented that change. And so right off the bat, illegal cannabis was way cheaper than legal cannabis, and it was hard for the legal market to keep up. Now, that was early on in legalization. That's one example of the government failing to pick where they want to regulate cannabis. Another example could be taxation. So when it comes to taxation, they tax it like a recreational product. So like alcohol. And so there are sin taxes, and there's an excise tax and sales taxes, and there are other boutique taxes that are added into the mix. Obviously, the negative consequence of that is that the more expensive you make legal cannabis, the less likely people are to buy it in comparison to the alternative. And then one more example, just again to highlight how the government was all over the place, is advertising. So if we were going to treat cannabis like a recreational product, you would assume that it would have the same regulations as alcohol. So fairly liberal. We can have billboards and direct-to-consumer advertisement, and you can see commercials on TV that advertise a new sale on a particular product. And you can brand your product along, let's say, lifestyle lines. So I use this example in North America. Michelob Ultra is a very popular beer. It's low calorie, low carb, and it's very much targeted towards those who are caring about fitness or watching their caloric intake, and they brand the product in that way. All of that type of branding is illegal for cannabis. You can't do any of it. And so when it comes to advertising, they put cannabis more in the pharmaceutical or medical bucket, which is very heavily restricted. And again, if it comes down to, and I'll probably say this a dozen more times throughout the course of this Q&A, when we limit the legal market's ability to advertise, it limits their ability to attract the people who are already consuming cannabis and consuming it illegally. When we let them advertise, it sends a signal to those illegal market consumers that, oh, there are legal options available to me, and maybe I should make the switch, and maybe I should try that out. And so the overarching theme of where everything went wrong is the government couldn't make a decision on which bucket it wanted to place cannabis in terms of how it would be regulated. And it created this really ridiculous patchwork where there are all sorts of inconsistencies, and it's created a lot of headaches, both for recreational users and, which is very important, medical users and medical patients as well.
So there's a long road ahead, clearly. And just to kind of add more confusion or more kind of lack of direction, I suppose you would call it, Canada doesn't exactly have a clear-cut policy on the future of CBD and the kind of health and wellness market insofar as the way some states in America have, and certainly many European countries too, the UK being a massive endorser of CBD at the moment, the second largest market outside of the US at the moment. So where do we stand on CBD in Canada? Because certainly to us over here across the pond, it does seem to be a very gray area.
Yeah. So the Cannabis Act, unfortunately, did not differentiate between the various types of cannabis products in terms of THC versus CBD. And so, one policy change that I've advocated for with the Senate here in Canada is that we remove non-intoxicating CBD products entirely from the Cannabis Act, so that they can be so that CBD products can be treated in the same way that they are in many places in the United States. And in
So
some,
just to clarify, my
Mhm.
understanding is the Cannabis Act sees cannabis, THC, CBD all as one thing.
Yeah, I
These are
guess I should give
all
you.
controlled substances, whereas here in
Yeah,
the UK, CBD is uncontrolled.
yeah. So an example would be legal cannabis can only be sold through licensed retailers. In some provinces, those stores are owned by the government. In some provinces, they're fairly regulated, or some would argue heavily regulated, private retail spaces. If you were to want a CBD product, you would have to buy it from a licensed cannabis retailer.
Okay.
So, from my point of view, I think that that's quite ridiculous because the existence of the regulatory framework is really about THC. It's about youth access and it's about THC. It's not about CBD. But the Cannabis Act failed to differentiate between products that could cause, I'm going to use the word intoxication, and products that don't. And so when I say we should get rid of CBD products from the Cannabis Act entirely, we should establish whatever the threshold is for intoxication. Some US states have already done this. And then we should treat CBD products like natural health food products. So they should be able to be sold alongside your vitamins in your grocery store, or in beverages sold along energy drinks or anything else you would pick up in that space. I think that that would go a long way to having a more healthy and dynamic legal market in Canada, because ultimately it increases access. And we know that there is a huge swath of consumers who are cannabis curious, but they're not necessarily curious because they want a high THC product and they want to get really high. They're curious because they want to try and experiment with different levels of THC or no THC at all and
Mhm.
just have whatever the therapeutic benefits of CBD are. And unfortunately, the system as it is now sends the wrong signal to consumers because if a product with, let's say, 24% THC is available at a cannabis store, and a product with 0% THC is only available at that cannabis store as well, it sends the wrong signal to consumers that those two products are somewhat similar or similar at all, when in fact they aren't. And so I would argue that if we were to separate non-intoxicating CBD products from the Cannabis Act, we could have them sold more liberally and have much more open access to those products, which I think is really the regulatory approach that CBD products deserve. Because if I mean, I'm one of the people who will kind of loudly say that cannabis with THC is a relatively benign product, and if cannabis with THC is a benign product, I can't think of a word to describe just non-intoxicating CBD products, because I mean those are probably less damaging to human health than caffeine, or anything else that is just regularly available or freely available in society. And so I think we have to have a more adult approach when it comes to understanding that there are different types of products and understanding that they have to be regulated differently based on relative harms and things like that.
I want to ask you about Health Canada, because Health Canada, obviously being like the public health agency essentially for the whole kind of country, and looking at the advice that it gives on various different things, such as CBD or vaping or anything like that. I remember a couple of years ago when Health Canada not to the same extent that Public Health England did, but to some sort of extent, it did start to kind of endorse vaping as a smoking cessation product. And I remember being here in the UK thinking, oh, you know, Public Health England did it, now Health Canada is doing it, and other governments are starting to do it. But when it comes to CBD, they're not really taking the same kind of, they're not being as proactive, I suppose. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because there's still a lingering prohibition mentality that exists with policymakers and regulators across the board, and it's not something that they're traditionally used to dealing with. And so, from a tobacco control perspective, they've been dealing with that for decades. And so, when vaping comes along, I think Health Canada has done a okay job in terms of embracing vaping and harm reduction, not nearly to the same extent as has been done in the UK. Um, but it is strange that the government has not, or Health Canada has not embraced that same approach when it comes to cannabis products or even CBD products. And what's a real shame is that that mentality has kind of filtered down into legislatures, where you will have the province of British Columbia create a 20% vape sin tax. And so vape products across the board will have an additional 20% tax added on to the sale of the item, whether that's a cannabis vape product, whether it's a cannabis vape product with no THC, whether it's a nicotine vape product. And from the perspective of harm reduction, if we can avoid combustion, that is a win for public health. And it's a real shame that Health Canada has not kind of applied their same logic to the cannabis space when it comes to vaping and harm reduction.
So let's talk about next steps. And obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected Canada as much as it has any other population, making it a little bit trickier to kind of get our everyday agenda passed through the various chains of government that you need to kind of talk to and go through. As an advocacy group, the Consumer Choice Centre, what kind of stuff are you doing? What's in the pipeline for you to try and get, you know, greater advocacy and try and get a message about CBD out there to normalize it a little bit more, and maybe to destigmatize it away from cannabis and away from the Cannabis Act, like you were talking about?
Yeah, well, the Cannabis Act will be up for review in October. And so our goal is to be as involved in that education process as possible. And so, like you said, making the case for removing CBD, non-intoxicating CBD products entirely from the Cannabis Act. I think that will go a long way in terms of having a more realistic and appropriate approach to how CBD products are accessed in this country. But I would argue that it also rests on our ability to completely reevaluate the Cannabis Act as it's written. And so I'm one of the voices who is of the opinion that when we do review the Cannabis Act, we have to do a full-scale review that concludes that we really overdid it in terms of how we regulated cannabis products. Everything from point of sale to possession limits to the advertising and marketing restrictions to what can be put on a cannabis package to the difference between THC and CBD. I think in retrospect, and this is my hope, that legislators will be able to look back and go, okay, it was great that we legalized cannabis, but we were way too heavy-handed. This is a product that does not deserve to be treated like a pharmaceutical. It does not deserve to be treated like tobacco when it comes to advertising. It's something that is relatively benign and should be regulated as such. And the reason why all of that matters is because the people who are going to benefit the most from that change are consumers and patients. Mm-hmm. So from the medical side, if you can get rid of the excise tax and sales taxes on medical cannabis, that's a huge win for patient access. I mean, it's incredibly cruel that medical cannabis is the only prescription drug in Canada where you pay a sin tax and a sales tax. Wow. So getting rid of that would be a huge step for patients. And then all of those changes, which I've kind of written on at length over the last 2+ years, would really benefit consumers and benefit consumers to the point where the legal market could make additional strides in curbing the illegal market. And that was one of the biggest priorities for policymakers when they went ahead with legalizing cannabis. And I don't think that they've failed in terms of that ambition, but they certainly haven't done as well as they could have. And I'm of the opinion that if we were to have a more adult approach to how we regulate cannabis, how we regulate THC and CBD products, at the end of the day, we'll have a healthier market here in Canada. We will have much more competition, which benefits consumers and patients, and will ultimately make the legal market more attractive than the black market. And we don't have to arrest our way out of this problem of the continuance of the black market. And so that would be our goal as a consumer advocacy group, especially as the Cannabis Act comes up for review in October.
That's October 2021 as opposed to October just gone.
Yes.
Before we leave it for today, I just wanted to ask you your opinion on legalization in other countries. Now that Canada has kind of taken that initial step to decriminalize and legalize and regulate one way or the other. We're talking a lot during this online event at Voxpo that we have about New York, for example, and New York and the advocacy that's going on there at the moment, and a push to get Governor Cuomo there to legalize in 2021. We're talking about New Zealand and the referendum that they just had. So what do you think is the kind of right step for a country to take that maybe Canada didn't take and should have taken? For example, the UK, who might be looking at it in the next decade or so.
So I think I would argue that all of the jurisdictions that you mentioned should look to Canada in terms of how they should legalize. But I say that with great caution because they shouldn't replicate many of the mistakes that Canada made. And so you brought up New Zealand, and I know in some of their draft legislation, they included, so first they didn't differentiate between THC and CBD products. So it appears as if that's a mistake that they're going to replicate. They had fairly serious restrictions on advertising, which is another huge problem. They included possession limits, which is another kind of relic of prohibition. And when it comes to possession limits, a lot of people will say, well, I mean, who needs to have more than 14 grams of cannabis, which is what the proposal was in New Zealand or in Canada? Who needs to have more than 30 grams on them at a time? That's a perfectly fine question, but we don't ask those questions for people who consume alcohol. I can go buy a case of 12 bottles of wine or a case of 12 bottles of Johnny Walker, and I'm never going to be harassed by police. I can bring it home. I can buy more than that. I can buy on bulk. Let's say I wanted to buy, I buy all of the alcohol I want for a year, and I do it in one trip. The cashier may look at me like I'm having some sort of party, and maybe would want to get invited to that party, but it never crosses over into the legal realm. You're never harassed by police or asked what your intentions are, and so those mistakes being replicated, in my view, is a real shame. One more anecdote on that is, and this just goes to reference why Canada is both a model to look at, but not a model to replicate. My colleagues and I were in Luxembourg last year, meeting with government officials, explaining to them what has worked and what has not worked in terms of the Canadian experience with legalization. And what was funny is those same legislators had met representatives from the Canadian government the week before. And they were stunned at our criticism because after their meetings, they said, well, I mean, we can't believe that there are so many issues. We didn't know about any of this. The representatives from the government said that everything is going fantastic. And so that made me incredibly frustrated and also incredibly depressed, because it means that our representatives are using our model as one to reference, but also one to replicate. And I think it's important, for the sake of patients and consumers, that we take a step back. You embrace legalization, because I think there is no, in my opinion, there's no rational justification to continue to criminalize people for having a plant in their pocket. That just has always seemed ridiculous to me. And whatever the negative consequences of legalization are, they're far less than the negative consequences of prohibition. So I would urge policymakers, whether they're in New York, New Zealand, the UK, yes, you should carry forward with legalization, both medically and for adult use recreational cannabis, but use Canada as a reference point on what's worked and what hasn't, and have that reflection, rather than saying, oh, Canada has done it, we're going to do what they did. Say, no, let's be critical in our review. This is what they did and worked. This is what they did and didn't work. And this is how we're going to move forward. And so that consumers in the UK or consumers in New York don't go through the same ups and downs as patients and consumers have in Canada. And so that would be my big suggestion for those who are looking at legalization abroad, is continue to carry that banner and continue to push for legalization across the board, but make sure that you do so with a critical eye, and you avoid those very heavy-handed policy mistakes that have been made in Canada.
Good advice. Good advice. Before we go, for anyone who would like to get in touch with you to learn about your work, or to learn more about your advocacy group, the Consumer Choice Centre in Canada, how can people get in touch?
Yeah, so our website is consumerchoicecenter.org. You can find me on Twitter at Clement Liberty, where I tweet on all sorts of issues. So if you have any questions or feedback on the Canadian cannabis experience, or maybe want to ask a couple follow-up questions in response to this webinar, feel free to tweet at me, and I'll be sure to respond.
Excellent. David Clement, North American Affairs Manager at the Consumer Choice Centre for Canada. Thank you for your time.
Appreciate it. Thank you.